And I just list here just a quick summary of why I think this is so profound. First off, the evidence is deep. That means to say, instead of finding the mechanism, every time we look for a mechanism, we found one. And that's a really provocative thought. I find that so exciting because, and I wish I had the time to share with you what I feel like goes on inside of a cell. I mean, it's a dynamic system. It's an amazing system. There's all this stuff sort of working together. Millions of chemicals that somehow they just all feed in together and they converge to create the same effect. And that's what's happening when protein is fed. So it's real. This is not fake. So it's deep. It's multiple mechanisms. It's relevant because we're working in the range of 5 to 20%. We're not given, really high levels to make us sick or animals sick or anybody, us animals or other animals sick. We're talking about regular levels, so it's relevant. Breast, this effect works also for mammary tumors. That's breast cancer. I had a colleague at the University of Illinois who was working on this at the time, not going into quite so much detail as we did, but nonetheless getting similar results, showing that he could control mammary tumor development as well. Also, this effect could be used in cases where the tumor was started with either a chemical carcinogen or a virus. I mean, some viruses start cancer, like hepatitis B virus that kills the liver cancer. We could basically turn that on and turn it on off too, simply by changing protein intake. The specificity, that's where really things really kind of started heating up, because in this case, when we use soy or wheat, same level, 20%, it didn't do it. Kind of unique for casein. And of course, now I'm thinking, I better start talking about this a little more publicly and getting into trouble, of course, along the way. But quite frankly, I didn't want to stop just at the point of focusing on one nutrient, protein, because I have a problem with that. As I said in the beginning, I think nutrition is about the holistic, integrated effect of all kinds of stuff in food. It really is what it is. So I don't want to just focus on just this protein effect. Maybe when we're consuming animal protein, for example, we're consuming as food, maybe the other things in there don't necessarily go along with it. So we wanted to expand our investigation a little bit and ask whether or not it was consistent with other biological effects within that range. And for that, we went into the literature. We had some of our own information, our own data, went into the literature. And here's what animal proteins do. They increase blood cholesterol. That was first observed in 1909 and studied extensively in the 40s and 50s. And in humans, extensive human studies in the 70s and 80s, to the point that animal protein, in my view, is more hypercholesterolemic than a saturated fat. Certainly more than cholesterol itself. It's that significant, and there's lots of studies on that. Lactoalbumin is another protein in milk, for example. It increases atherosclerosis and other experimental conditions, really quite dramatic. It compromises vitamin D status and increases prostate cancer. Animal protein does. And now we know a lot about that. I think it was Dean already said something about this, as I recall. I forget it was Neil or Dean. Said something about the vitamin D thing. Well, the vitamin D story is now emerging. You probably heard we all should take vitamin D. It's not really true. People are sort of getting caught in this idea of taking vitamin D when they're consuming the wrong diet, but that's not going to do them a lot of good, in my view. Now we know also animal proteins increase that. This is what Dr. Ornish, I think, pointed out, this insulin-like growth factor 1. It's sort of like the cholesterol of the cancer field. It turns on IGF-1, plant proteins decrease it, increases calcium bone loss. I mean, in other words, you start looking at the literature, you find this animal protein thing is really quite substantial. So then you ask another question. What about other nutrients other than animal protein? Maybe are there dietary patterns here? Getting away from this thing about single nutrients and get on into a broader view of the field, if you will. Maybe animal-based foods versus plant-based foods. That's one way to divide it up. I mean, I should suggest for your thinking there's another way too, and that's talking about whole natural foods, if you will, as opposed to breaking the foods up and making, things like sugar and fat all by itself. But so this is one way, just animal versus plant-based foods. And so we decided to do a comprehensive human study. It was fortuitous that, in fact, we had this opportunity in rural China, and I want to tell you a little bit about the rural China, this China study, because there, as we entered into that study, I came into that study with a background of having serious questions about animal protein and looking for dietary patterns. And the study came about because the Chinese government had established in the 70s that for about a dozen different cancers, these cancers were highly localized geographically around the country. Again, the National Institutes of Health, together with the Chinese government, funded this study. It was the first joint study between the United States and China at the time. And I just want to acknowledge some of my colleagues who obviously made all this possible for all of us to work together. The four of us were involved. Sir Richard Peto from the University of Oxford in England, brilliant biostatistician, I should add. Myself, Wenharn Pan was a student of ours, a PhD student of ours at Cornell. And Junsho Chen, who's really one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. He now tends to be, since I've known him, tends to be the Chinese representative of the United Nations, various panels and so forth. Chen's like a brother. That's why we look alike, by the way. In the China study, here were some really exciting data showing that, you know, when I said that cancers occurred in certain parts of the country and not in others, the range of rates, if you will, across the country for these different cancers are shown here for men and women. And you can see it's, what, 2 or 3 dozen-fold, maybe a couple hundred-fold. I mean, cancer was localized in some places, was right here, and over here it's not here. They had that kind of concentration. In this country, if we see a 2-fold concentration, or even less, it makes headlines. Here we're talking about big differences. That's ideal, incidentally, for doing a study. So, okay, let's go to China and organize and see what, in fact, they're doing. And we organized 65 counties, 130 villages, 6,500 adults and their families across the whole of China to do the study. Shown here in the first thing, wide range of rates, as I said. We also had an opportunity to look at a whole lot of other diseases as well as the cancers. Collected all kinds of information on diet, and lifestyle, and disease by collecting blood samples and urine samples and food samples and asking questions and so forth and so on, and then analyzing them. Before I get to that, let me just point out to you why the study in some ways was so unique. I'll go back to the original chart of Ken Carroll's, where you see fat intake and breast cancer in a nice straight line. Really impressive. We all making assumptions as dietary fat, if you will. However, those impressions about dietary fat and breast cancer were largely drawn from studies that were done in the upper right quadrant. See where the United States is? We're up there. We're getting close to leading the pack in terms of breast cancer and a lot of these diseases. And so all these human studies have been conducted, case control studies and prospective cohort studies and studies like this have been done on people living up in that region of the world there. Our study was the first that was actually going down near the bottom and looking at what the relationship really is. And this is important because if that line for the whole thing, you know, we knew in the upper right-hand quadrant as far as individual studies are concerned that it fit that line, but we didn't know down here at the bottom. And people were in the research world saying, oh, maybe this is not true. Maybe this is just because we have more telephone poles in some places. I mean, all these silly things. So we just wanted to have a look from the dietary perspective about China, and China was in the lower left-hand quadrant. Now here's just some summary information on what we found in China. We ended up looking at lots and lots of different things, as you'll see in a moment. But I just want to summarize here a couple of points. First off, in rural China, look at the energy intake. The calorie intake is higher. It's 10, 11% higher in rural China than is here per body weight. Well, part of that is attributable to the fact that the Chinese are more physically active. However, this will surprise you. The Chinese we're looking at here, these are the office worker type Chinese. They're the least active, and they're still consuming 10 to 11% more. I mean, they still go to work on their bicycles and things like that, so I think, but there's another effect here, and it has to do with the fact, I'm convinced of this, people who are consuming a low-fat, sort of plant-based diet, basically consume more energy and end up gaining less body weight. You heard Dr. Orney say that. And I think Dr. Bernard said the same thing, and Dr. McDougall, of course, and others have made this point many times. Eat more, weigh less kind of thing. You can see the body mass index, which is the body mass or weight, excess weight, is lower in China. Okay, the fat intake in China, as you can see, is much lower than here, 14% versus 36%. In rural China, dietary fiber is about 3 times higher. There's the key, is animal protein, and just using it as an index of the kind of diet. Our diet in the United States and other Western countries has 10 times the concentration of animal protein as does, or was, in fact, the case in rural China. That's changing, incidentally, in China, particularly in the city areas. They're starting to do what we do, and I don't know why they're doing that, but they're doing it. Blood cholesterol levels in rural China, their high is near our low. The average cholesterol level in rural China is about 127 milligrams per deciliter. Really quite remarkable. But enough for that. We then, actually with many colleagues from different universities and elsewhere, looked at specific relationships that were of interest at the time. And basically, it seemed like every time we looked for a relationship and then asked this kind of question, does it point to this dietary pattern thing, does it point to an animal thing or a plant thing? First, every time we looked at it, it says it points to a plant-based diet. And this was really quite remarkable because keep in mind, in China, the amount of animal protein they were consuming is really quite low. It's only 1/10 of ours. But still within that range, what we can see, as soon as they start creeping up and getting little animal protein-based foods in their diet, these Western diseases started to occur. And we looked at this in many different ways. Really quite remarkable. So it went beyond the question of animal protein per se. The more significant question was just animal-based foods and or the lack of plant-based foods. Whole natural plant-based foods. So after doing a lot of these comparisons and interpreting a wide variety of these relationships, as I said, virtually all favor the nutrient composition of plant-based foods. And we sort of made that conclusion. We hesitate in science sometimes to make conclusions like this, but by this time, after having so much information and such a broad basis for the information, it led to that thing at the bottom. The richer the diets is and the kind of amount of nutrients provided by plant-based foods, the lower is the risk for these chronic degenerative diseases we see in the West. Now, I want to go back a little bit because it raises some other kinds of questions. Let's go back to the background slide I showed in the beginning of Ken Carroll that seemed to captivate so many of us for so long, showing a relationship between breast cancer and total fat. And let's look at that line a little closely. And just allow me to speculate a little bit here. If you take that line down, it crosses that x-axis at the bottom, where you can see there's no breast cancer when people are consuming, what is it, 30 grams or so a day of fat? That's about right. We need some fat, but it's pretty low. In other words, up to about that level of fat, we don't really see anything. It's kind of neat. I went back and actually took... Ken Carroll had these data. I just simply put some lines on it, some regression lines. But it turns out if you look at, as he did, you look at the relationship between plant fats and cancers, breast cancer, you don't see anything. So it's something about it. It's not plant fats. But if you look at animal fats, now see where that line goes? Right through the origin. Very different. I mean, that's really pretty remarkable, I think. And that line, I mean, it couldn't be better. It sort of says even adding just a small amount of animal fat. If we sort of, I'm going to call animal fat, let's put single quotes around that. You know, just small amounts of animal fat sort of starts creating this problem. However, I'm going to call it animal-based foods. We made a mistake 20, 30 years ago in focusing on fat. It wasn't animal fat. In fact, we have evidence now to suggest that maybe the polyunsaturated fats of plants are more problematic in causing tumor growth than the animal fats. But, big but, this only occurs when total fat intake is high. So it raises questions about high-fat diets, quite frankly. So it's animal-based foods, not fat. Now I want to go back to another question, and this has to do with the Nurses' Health Study, and I'm sorry I have to pick on the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard. I know the investigators there quite well, have known them from the beginning, particularly Professor Willett, who has been heading this up.